What can we do to change STEM so that it's more welcoming to everyone?
It starts at the beginning. I always think in terms of pipeline. So in terms of education, it is, how do you expose young kids of all ethnicities and genders around the world to STEM careers in a way that makes them attractive and accessible. We're soon going to be launching a series called Epistemologies of the Global South, which I'm very excited about.
Amy, welcome to the Super Data Science Podcast. I've been so excited about getting you on the program. Where in the world are you calling in from?
I am calling in from Newton, Massachusetts, not too far from Cambridge.
Nice. And not surprising that you are close to Cambridge, given that you work at MIT Press, which is in Cambridge. So I'm sure all listeners are aware of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is one of the world's foremost universities. And it has a great press. So the MIT Press is one of the world's largest university publishers. It's behind, in our industry, the Adaptive Computation and Machine Learning series, which is edited by the absolutely iconic data scientists Christopher Bishop, Michael I. Jordan, and others. And it includes books like Ian Goodfellow, Yoshua Bengio, and Aaron Courville's Deep Learning book, which is a Bible. For me, it is the book probably that I refer to the most of any. And it's a great example of an MIT Press book that is freely available as HTML at deeplearningbook.org. We're going to talk about that freeness again very soon. Other titles in the series are Sutton and Bartow's Reinforcement Learning, an Introduction, Kevin Murphy's Machine Learning, a Probabilistic Perspective, and a couple of dozen other amazing books. So thank you, Amy, for being behind such amazing books.
Thank you. And yeah, we publish a lot in data science going out into even less kind of machine learning computational areas. So happy to be here.
Awesome. So what does it mean to be a director and publisher at MIT Press? What does that role involve?
I have one of the most fun jobs in the world because I just get to live in this world of just amazing ideas and help people see their creative works through to fruition. But day to day, what it means is running an organization of 100 plus people, mainly in the Boston, Cambridge area, but several of them in the UK as well. We publish about 350 books a year across a range of disciplines, 40 journals. I feel sometimes like the orchestra conductor. I'm, trying to make it all work smoothly. But I have a fabulous team. We're a pretty non-hierarchical organization. That's the director part. The publisher part, which was added to my title about a year ago, and I was kind of insistent on it, was really important to me because I get to sign all the publishing contracts. So I'm ultimately responsible for making those decisions. Now, of course, I consult widely with my team and others.
So literally every single book that gets published by the MIT Press, your signature is on the contract. You make a final decision.
That is correct. Yes.
Wow, that's cool. I didn't realize that one person could have so much power.
Yeah, it's somewhat distributed. Actually, less distributed at MIT than a lot of other university presses, where the kind of faculty editorial boards are, have more power than they do at MIT. It's more consultative, but that was decided long before I became director.
Cool, yeah. And so publisher for the last year, at least in your title, having that there.
Yeah.
But director for 7 years. You have been leading MIT Press for some time. So something that we alluded to already when I was talking about the Goodfellow book and it's being freely available online is that MIT Press publishes a lot of books with open access. So over 12% of books are freely available. Why is open access valuable to scientists, data scientists, anybody doing research and development?
Well, I think it's valuable to all scholars and researchers. There's a special value to people in data science when you think about having that underlying information available to mine and compute over. But our investment in open access goes back literally decades at the MIT Press. And for us, it's an issue of making scholarship as equitably accessible around the world as possible, to as many researchers as possible and readers as possible, and also to broadening participation in the whole research enterprise by making this information widely available. Um, Among many other things that I'm involved in relation to the open data, open science, open access space is I'm on the board of Creative Commons, which of course is the organization that
No
created
kidding.
and
Wow.
runs the open licenses that we all use when we put our works online.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't catch that in my research before the episode. That's amazing. And yeah, it makes so much sense to me that research, academic work, which is often publicly funded, it makes sense to me that it should be available then to the public to read. And so there's been a big shift since I've been an academic. So it's now 10 years since I finished my PhD. And it was during my PhD period where um, not only did we start to digitize works, so it's crazy to me to think that in my undergrad, especially in the first couple of years of my undergrad, I had to physically go to the library
That's
and
right.
photocopy journal articles that I wanted
Yeah.
to read later.
If you look back at the history of digital information and open access, it really did take off in the scientific journal space. But now today, and certainly in the way in which we publish at the MIT Press, it's across all disciplines and everything that we publish. But it's a complicated topic. So you mentioned, okay, publicly funded research should be openly accessible. It's not that simple. I mean, that is a
Mm,
core principle, but often you are talking about the creative works, blood, sweat, and tears of an individual or a lab that has data that
right.
it wants to use and leverage in other ways. And so these decisions are sometimes, individual decisions, not necessarily made on the principle that it should be open. So for us, for example, when we publish open access books, it's always with the consent of the author, if it's something that we initiate, or because the authors, like in the case of the deep learning book, have demanded or expected that the work be made openly accessible. And that was a great example for us because, we it's very easy if you look at the business of publishing for us to take, say, scholarly monographs and professional books, which have a relatively specialized, limited audience, and say, we'll figure out a model in which we can make those openly available. We'll still sell some in print and digital form. But if you look at, our textbook program, especially in computer science, AI, machine learning, which has been so core to the revenue of the press and the history of the press, it's a lot harder. But now, a huge percentage of our reference and textbooks in AI, machine learning are openly available. And what we saw with deep learning was just, it was the right book at the right time, and it was so tremendously successful in print while it was being made openly available.
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell because you can't kind of you it's hard to figure out from the data what the causal impact is, but I hypothesize without any real data to back me up that making something publicly available, it increases the reach so much. It allows a book like Deep Learning to have such a broad impact that everybody's aware of it. You're like, wow, this amazing book is available online. But you're also like, but a lot of people, despite having access to it online, for me, for a lot of people, having the physical book, I'm able to attend to it a lot better. I'm able to make a lot more progress. I feel like I can understand concepts a lot better as a result of that. You can step away from the computer and just work through the book. And so for me, the book is then hugely valuable. And so I might look at the first few pages online, the first chapter, and then I'm like, oh my goodness, I've got to buy this. And I think that that experience happens for a lot of people.
I think that's true. We see that a lot in open textbooks where we know that students want to have the digital file as well as that print book. And yeah, certainly with a book like this, with many books, we've done some experiments where it hasn't worked so well. So, for example, when we've done like a $0 Kindle edition of a book, that
Mhm.
really depresses print sales. And so, we've had to kind of find our way to doing this because we believe it's the right thing to do, and we want to support our authors who want their works to be openly available, but making it sustainable. Um, so,
That's cool. That
yeah,
that makes a lot of sense, and that explains why it says on deeplearningbook.org, it says, there's something like an FAQ at the bottom that's like, "Can I get a PDF version?" It's like, "No, you can't."
yeah.
Uh,
Well,
because yeah,
I'm in. Yeah, I'd love to be able. We aspire going forward to be able to figure out the model that does allow us to have that PDF. We're
yeah.
still working on it. So
No, I mean, in terms of a browsing experience on your computer anyway, I think HTML is better. Like, there's no point in having this idea that information should fit into a small box
yeah.
shape when you can scroll infinitely anyway. So,
Mm.
I think that's great. So, going beyond just MIT Press, what tools or technologies are needed to build public digital infrastructure for open access publishing?
So that's a great question. I think it would surprise a lot of people looking from the outside at the publishing industry and seeing all the digital publishing that's happening to know how consolidated the underlying platforms and technologies are. So in the university press world, for example, there are very few hosting platforms that we choose among. And I can remember early on when I had gotten involved in the world of digital publishing, I kept thinking like, wow, I should go off and just build one of these digital hosting platforms because there's so much demand. And you look at academic journal publishers, and they're literally hopping back and forth between two or three, or maybe three or four choices of these platforms, a couple of which, by the way, are now owned by private equity, but that's another conversation. I believe very strongly that this is a space that needs more competition, that needs some open source solutions. One of the things that I've been really pleased to have been involved in over the last several years was helping launch an independent nonprofit called Knowledge Futures, which created, developed, and runs open source community publishing technologies for a range of different groups. And the MIT Press does a lot of its open book publishing on PubPub. It's the PubPub platform that Knowledge Futures runs. Several of our journals, like the Harvard Data Science Review, but there are other universities, other presses, even governments that use the platform. And the way that I
Hmm.
think about it is, this isn't about the way in which we do science publishing or data publishing is absolutely broken. So we have to destroy what we have and create something new. I think about it in terms of multiple levers of change and creating alternatives that work well, and that gradually kind of shift the wheel and the balance of power. And when I speak about the balance of power, I'm talking about the power that a lot of these large commercial companies, both publishing companies and technology companies, have over the research publication space.
Cool. Very interesting and amazing how many different organizations related to open source that you're involved with personally. So the MIT Press itself, in a way, lots of open source involvement, the Creative Commons, and now also to hear about Knowledge Futures. Very cool. So we have your thoughts, and clearly we know how important it is to have openness in books, in papers. What are your thoughts also on making data and code available where possible?
Yeah. And anybody that's publishing research today thinks about the products of the research process beyond just the textual content. We're thinking also of what is the methodology and what were the protocols in the research and how can that information be shared? What about the data? And certainly what about the code? And what we all aspire to is having all of this content accessible in ideally standardized ways that protects people's privacy where it needs to be protected, protects the interests of researchers that, for whatever reason, might not be in a position to share their data, but that ultimately allows us to accelerate the pace of research and discovery by being able to compute over that data, over that code, et cetera. So, I feel very, very strongly about that. It's a somewhat different conversation for a publisher like me, though, than it is for a university or a funding agency. I think early on, when we became aware of the fact that if we publish a journal article, say in neurochemistry, and we feel like it's the best policy to make the related data available, it's not necessarily that we are publishing the data. We are essentially enforcing a policy that says, for this journal, you have to make your data available, but you're going to make it available through your university or potentially through, your funding partner or on some other platform or repository.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a much bigger, for as I see it, this is an issue of governments, and in the U.S. certainly at the federal level, to come up with that solution. What is going to be our data commons to accelerate research? And if you think about the global situation right now, and the position that the U.S. is in with respect to its preeminence in research now, as opposed to several years ago, the ability to capture, preserve, share, and ultimately mine research data is a big part of what we want to see going forward.
Right. That makes sense. Struggling with broken pipelines, stale dashboards, missing data? You're not alone. Look no further than Monte Carlo, the leading end-to-end data observability platform. In the same way that New Relic and Datadog ensure reliable software and keep application downtime at bay, Monte Carlo solves the costly problem of data downtime. As detailed in episode number 499 with the firm's brilliant CEO Bar Moses, Monte Carlo monitors and alerts for data issues across your data warehouses, lakes, ETL, and business intelligence, reducing data incidents by 90% or more. Start trusting your data with Monte Carlo today. Visit www.montecarlodata.com to learn more. So it's super cool to me how this kind of openness, and yes, we do need to have considerations probably just beyond. Yeah, there are more complications. Just geopolitical complications around how much things can be shared. But generally speaking, geopolitical situations notwithstanding, the availability of papers, books, data, code, the more people that have access to it, the more brains there are involved in solving problems that can have a huge impact on society. So every single person in the world, every single person listening to this podcast in particular, has the capacity to make an enormous impact with what they do with their lives. And the more information that you have access to, whether for reading or for feeding into your models, the bigger your impact can be. It's, it's taking the long view of decades or centuries. We live at a time today where a lot of people in the world, certainly not everyone in the world, but a lot of people in the world, for the first time in history, don't have to worry about whether they're going to have enough to eat, and don't have to worry about being murdered in a war. It's, there's obviously exceptions at this time that we're recording. There's are particularly salient exceptions, but generally speaking, we enjoy this abundance that would have been unimaginable 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, even. And yeah, science progress has facilitated this, and I'm kind of reiterating the point now, but the more brains that have access to this
brains and machines, right? It's brains and machines.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
That is I agree 100%. But on the point of brains, we want to make sure that all of the brains have the opportunity to participate. So
that is correct.
So science and engineering, historically, women and minorities are underrepresented in these fields. So we can call them the STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, and math. STEM. There's this underrepresentation issue where we are not. So even if we lived in this world where there weren't geopolitical issues and we didn't worry about particular information getting into particular people's hands, we could have all of this data, all of this information be open access. But if we have this inequity, we're still not making the most of it,
It's
because we're
absolutely
not
right.
getting everyone involved.
Yeah. I agree wholeheartedly. I think about it in terms of that brain power. I think about, think of what's lost when you don't have a whole participation, of a population in solving certain problems. And so this is an issue now, certainly in research, the ability of people in the global south to participate in research and the way in which how we publish. And I, as a publisher, think about this impacts that. It's not just the access to content. Who, what is authorship and who has the right to participate as an author? What are the barriers to that? This is a big
Mm.
issue right now in open access models, and I'd love to come back to that if you want to talk more about it. I think where you were going was around our interest at the press in publishing as many diverse, marginalized voices that previously have been underrepresented, and how that even changes, how we think about the definition of what science is. Um, you know, we're soon going to be launching a series called Epistemologies of the Global South, which I'm very excited about. But because of my own personal experience as a woman in science, I'd been a grad student at MIT. I was in academia for a while, and then I left to go into publishing. I felt like it wasn't a level playing field for men and women at all. And when I decided to come back to MIT in this role as director of the press, one of the things I really wanted to do was to use that privileged position to provide opportunities for women to publish about their STEM work, to create a platform for books that would inspire kids and especially young women and young girls into careers in science and technology. We've gone fully in that direction now, both in books that we're publishing at the MIT Press and in partnership with a children's publisher as well. And it did lead to my thinking of essentially conceiving of this film called Picture a Scientist. And
Yes.
yeah, and through that, I really wanted to pay homage to these women that I had known, some of whom I had known when I was a grad student at MIT in the 80s, and that I had heard about, through the years of having essentially gotten the president of MIT to admit in 1999, which seems like it's not too long ago, that women were being discriminated against in the resources they had access to, how they were being compensated, in the opportunities that they had access to, size of their labs, and that was a real turning point in academia. Yeah.
All right. So, Amy, you've talked about how MIT Press is involved in publishing not only books by women and minorities in STEM fields, but also about them and being a leader in that area. And then you also mentioned this film, Picture a Scientist, which is kind of related to that. So, not only is your work as director at MIT Press helping to create content for, about, by historically underrepresented books in STEM fields. But on top of that, you've been executive producer of this amazing film, Picture a Scientist. So I haven't finished it yet, but I've started it. I'm about halfway through, and it is completely absorbing. It is no surprise that it was selected for a 2020 Tribeca Film Festival appearance.
Premiere.
uh,
Yeah.
Premiere is the right word. I don't know the lingo.
Yeah.
Um,
It was so
and yeah, it's
sad. It
available.
was right before the pandemic. We were all set to go, and then it didn't happen. But it was selected. So yeah, is
It's
that
right in my
bad today?
neighborhood here.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm basically in Tribeca here,
Oh,
and yeah, I'm a little bit south of Tribeca, in the
cool.
financial district of Manhattan. But yeah, it is the pandemic ruined a lot of things, including being able to Was it like a virtual premiere or something like that?
There were some, I think there were some virtual screenings, but and of course it was still an honor to have been selected. But certainly the pandemic changed the whole course of how that film was seen by the world. But in some ways, for the better, because there were so many screenings on campus and so many good conversations with people. So.
Right, yeah, and it's available around the world on Netflix. It's about 100 minutes long, but if you don't have access to Netflix, there's even a 13-minute version called The Uprising that is kind of key excerpts of it, and that's available for free on the MIT YouTube channel. So, Amy, how did you get inspired to make this film? I guess you talked about already how you were exposed to these stories, being at MIT, this big change in 1999 around the president of the university having to acknowledge that women have smaller labs than men on average, and significantly smaller on average. But having that idea, thinking, hey, I'm aware of these stories, and I might have thought if I was running a publishing company, I might have thought I need to make a book about this. But you made a film about it. So how did that end up happening?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. When I was, I will say, when I was a grad student at MIT in the 80s, it was really hard to find a women's bathroom almost anywhere that you went. And this was, a constant source of griping. But
Huh.
I became aware of the fact, I guess it was about 4 or 5 years ago through the MIT libraries and the archives, that there was an effort to collect the papers of many incredibly eminent women at MIT who had been in the 90s, I think something like the only 16 or 17 tenured women on the faculty of science at MIT, just a very, very small number. I had known some of them when I was a grad student at MIT. And the archivist at the library said, maybe you want to do a book about this. And so I agreed to meet
Mhm.
with all of the women. I remember that meeting
Oh,
clearly to
wow.
this day. And it was in the course of that conversation that we thought, well, it would be a lot easier for everybody if we just did like we're doing now, film audio interviews of everyone to capture their story, and we'll build the book from there. And we were
Mm.
very quickly able to obtain funding for this project to collect all this footage. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge loaned us this incredible space to bring all the women together. Friends of mine who were closer to the film industry connected me to two incredible directors who take most of the credit for the ultimate film that you see, Sharon Shattuck and Ian Chaney. But I essentially hired them to come in and do these interviews. We got about 30 hours of interview footage with just, an incredible group. I think almost everyone who was still alive, who had, been part of this movement at MIT in the 90s that led to the report on the status of women on the faculty of science at MIT and led to then President Chuck Vest saying, and it being covered in the New York Times, that women were being discriminated against at MIT. All of those people, came back. And because the footage we captured was so remarkable, and, there was just
Mhm.
great, I would say, kind of synergy with the filmmakers, we realized that we had not only a book project, but we also
Uh-huh.
had the potential for a documentary film. And
Mhm.
um, Ian and Sharon, had, I was, as executive producer, my main function was to help raise money, which I did, for the film, while they sort of shaped the broader story that went out beyond MIT to bring in a couple of other just amazing women and their stories from other universities. So that's really how it came about. And the book, the book is happening, but it's not happening at the MIT Press. It's happening, elsewhere. But I'm so excited about it. A number of other book projects resulted from this as well. We just put out a book called Carbon Queen, which is a biography of Millie Dresselhaus, who was among the what we call the MIT 16, these remarkable women, and it's the story of her career at MIT. Um, so.
So incredible to hear that story. And having watched half the film, I can
Mhm.
confirm that there are stunning, um, emotionally moving interviews. Everybody presents, in everything I've seen so far, everybody presents what happened to them so articulately, um, and so clearly you can see, you can almost experience alongside them, uh, yeah, the unpleasantness or the unfairness, the unjustness of historically and probably still today, a lot of people experience. In fact, I know even from those interviews, definitely still today, that it sounds like, especially, if you add multiple of these minorities together. So if you're not just a woman or not just black, that if you're a black woman, then it's still today the at conferences, at university, in meetings, it sounds like there's lots of small ways that you are made to feel like you are not part of the community, that you're not, say, a scientist or an engineer.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, so hearing these stories presented so clearly, so articulately, um, yeah, it really, yeah, it's been a moving experience for me, and I can't wait to finish watching the film. Einblick is a faster and more collaborative way to explore your data and build models. It was developed at MIT and showed to reduce time to insight by 30 to 50%. Einblick is based on a novel progressive engine, so no matter the data size, your analysis won't slow down. And Einblick's novel interface supports the seamless combination of no-code operations with Python code. This makes Einblick the go-to data science platform for the entire organization. Sign up for free today at Einblick.ai. That's EINBLICK.ai. EINBLICK.ai.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I do think of it as that metaphor of like death by a thousand cuts, right? That through the course of whether you're in a Silicon Valley company or you're in a science department at Harvard or MIT or elsewhere, the day to day experiences of not being included or not being listened to or not being taken seriously, and it does continue, and addressing those concerns requires just ongoing vigilance, on the part of people who are in a position to make decisions about an individual's career growth. Um, and that in the period of time when I wasn't at MIT, in my professional career, I spent some of that time working at Harvard, in the provost's office, specifically on these issues, on faculty
Mm.
diversity and equity and career paths for faculty.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, so building on what you're saying there, I do really encourage people to watch this film, to get a sense of this in more detail. But an analogy um, that the film keeps coming back to is this idea of an iceberg, where
Yes.
above the surface there are really kind of blatant sexual harassment types of behaviors where like actual like groping or sexual comments, that kind of thing. These are the kinds of things that it's like obvious sexual harassment, but that's like the tip of the iceberg. It's a small amount of the issues that underrepresented people face in STEM fields. It's really what's under the water that has by far the biggest impact. What you just described is like the death by a thousand cuts, where it's being left off of an email chain or your opinion not being listened to in a meeting where that same opinion expressed by a white man is listened to. And so it's the accumulation of all of these kinds of things that, it sounds like certainly was a bigger issue at MIT in the 90s, but no question still happens today. As you say, in academia as well as in big tech companies, um, these kinds of, I don't want to say smaller, but like more subtle, um,
Hmm.
Yeah, more subtle behaviors in a way that maybe to the person who's saying them or doing them, you might not even be aware that it's having an impact. And I guess it's kind of that lack of awareness that hopefully films like this can bring up. That you if you are a white man, you could be going around doing and saying things that are having a big impact on people without you realizing it. So, beyond just the impact or the content of this film, I'd also love to learn a little bit about what it was like making it. So, you've alluded to this a little bit, but what does it mean to be the executive producer of a film? What is that like? You've talked about getting the film kind of off the ground, but then once you've had these interviews, you've got the footage, you realize, let's make this a movie. What happens next?
Yeah, so I came into this knowing absolutely nothing about making films, and I would not have known a few years ago what being an executive producer was either. So it came out of my interest in realizing that we could do this because I had fabulous creative partners and wanting to help make it happen, being in a position to help raise the funds to make the film happen. And I think it wasn't until it actually came to kind of signing agreements with the production company that Ian and Sharon were running to make this movie that executive producer was qualified as an individual who raises a certain amount of money or raises the majority of funding for the film. I think sometimes executive producers are more involved in the creative process. I was very much involved at the outset and have more of a kind of a stamp on the film, the short film that you mentioned, The Uprising. And then later, Ian and Sharon went off to realize, their creative vision in Picture a Scientist. And, I
Ah,
was in the background saying, I'm going to raise money to make this happen for you. Please consult with me. I want to make sure that, I still love what you're doing, but it was really their creative vision. And I'm
got
doing
it.
this again in an entirely different area. I've met this wonderful. I was living in Vermont during the pandemic, and I met a wonderful young filmmaker who's making a film actually about design build architecture in Vermont, which I'm also very passionate about, and I
Hmm.
have committed to executive produce another film in an entirely different
Oh,
area
cool.
because part of it is I just really I love working with young people. I love helping them see their interests and their passions come to fruition. So
Amazing. Well, I look forward to checking that out as well. Given how wonderful this film is, I'm sure that that will be a success as well. And then you also corrected me on something there. I didn't know that The Uprising came before Picture Scientist. So the short 13-minute film that's available on the MIT YouTube channel, that came first. I had this impression, not having watched that shorter film, that it was kind of like excerpts, like
well,
cut together to make.
they were developed at the
Oh,
same time
okay.
where we had we had an agreement that there would be a short film that was just about the MIT story, where the actually not just me, but it was effectively sponsored by the MIT press, which is unusual for a press to do, and that the longer film that was being made would be financially, even though I was raising money for it, was financially handled outside of MIT.
Got it, got it, got
So
it.
they're it's confusing. They're overlapping in many ways.
Right,
But
right. So they're 2 separate projects, but using some of the same media and
exactly.
conveying the same idea. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, cool. Well, so a prominent uh, issue in the film, which we've already talked about, is how, um, well, what culminates in 1999 in the president of MIT having to acknowledge that women, on average, have significantly smaller lab spaces than their equivalent male peers, equivalent at least in terms of title, like assistant professor, professor, that kind of thing. And so uh, the film discusses the lead up to that a fair bit. And so you were at MIT School of Science at that same time frame. You mentioned how coming across women's bathrooms, for example, could be something that's hard to do. Are there other things that you experienced while you were there?
Um, Yeah, and I think it was more, along the sort of subtle lines. I mean, being very, aware of
Right.
the fact that women were in a minority. Um, there were certainly some fabulous female mentors at MIT, but if you're coming into a field and you see that you are not as well represented as men, it whether consciously, unconsciously, um, makes you question your career choices.
Hmm.
I remember, you know, thinking that the women that I knew in the field that I was uh, working in, it seemed to me that they were working so much harder. I remember thinking that
Mm,
it just doesn't feel like a level playing field. Um,
right.
and I often feel that way today. I mean, I sometimes tell people the story like, okay, so I'm running this publishing company. I had the experience about 4 or 5 years ago of having to lay someone off, and and this was a white male, um, and I had very good reasons for letting him go, and I'm his boss, right? And I go to lay him off, and he looks at me and he says, "That is not acceptable." Like, actually, it is totally,
Wow.
and that's an everyday thing, and it just was such a like a wake up call to me because I thought, your worldview about your privilege and what is due to you versus, um, just a woman walking through the world. And I know, that the same issues come up in all kinds of industries. I do think that there is something about, academic science and the way in which we judge excellence and the way in which careers progress, where it's a particularly sticky problem where there's a lot of entrenched bias. And part of my interest in this relates to my work in the field of publishing, because I look at, what is that record of production in science, and how is excellence being assessed, right? And often it leads to, many more opportunities to exclude or marginalize women and other groups. All of It's almost like all of the underlying social dynamics get amplified and exacerbated through the systems that we use to do research, create new knowledge, publish it, judge it. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, something that I think can make that issue particularly salient in academia, and this is mentioned in the film Picture Scientist, which is why it's top of mind for me, is that there are these dependency structures embedded in it. So when you're doing your PhD, you typically have one PhD supervisor. And so if you're a young female PhD student and you have an older male PhD supervisor who has all of this power over you, it can create if that person wants to abuse that power, they're in a position where it's easier to do so. Um, and so yeah, so that was something about academia in particular that that was brought up there. And you kind
Exactly.
of you're dependent on this person if you want to then get a postdoc, you're going to need this person's letter of reference.
Uh-huh.
But actually, now that I'm saying that out loud, almost every work relationship is like that, where you're dependent on one person. Like
But
that kind of power dynamic. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, you want to make sure, whether you're, in school, in class with your professors, or in any job that you do, that you're thinking about, how do I make sure that I'm protecting these relationships, I get the best letter of reference that I can. But it does play out differently in academia because of the networks. I mean, we tend to think about, okay, you're in the discipline of biology or computer science, but think about all the subdisciplines within that and how small these communities are. These people, they know
Right.
one another. They might have,
Right.
the leaders might have gone to school together. Um, it does tend to be, to lend itself more to a certain type of cronyism.
Right. 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 That makes a lot of sense. Um, and yeah, to your point about how it can seem like, say, the women are needing to work a lot harder to be at the same position in academia as a man. There was an interesting part of an interview in the part of Picture Scientist that I've watched so far, where um, a woman of color, talks about how she ends up investing so much time in every email, making sure that she's getting the tone right,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a perception of, like, there can be stereotypes against her of, like, you know, being quick to be angry or something. And so she has to put all this extra care. And she's like, what if I add up all of that extra time spent trying to really articulate clearly in an email to make sure that I'm striking the right balance, as opposed to, maybe me as a white man, I can just say how I'm feeling and I'm not going to encounter the same kind of resistance or backlash. And so, yeah, so that was an interesting example to me, a specific example of how it can end up being the case that somebody in an underrepresented group can end up having to invest so much more time in getting the same outcome.
Yeah, that was the chemist Rachel Burks, and it's also for me one of the most salient stories in the film about the amount of time that she invests and how that's time away from doing the science that she wants to do. And
Mhm.
that comes through, in Nancy Hopkins' story as well. There's this moment, in the film where she says, I didn't want to be an activist. And all of a sudden I realized that
Right.
this is what I had to do. And to this day, she's become a good friend. She talks about, that her investing in telling the story and affecting this change through, you know, collective social action took away from her science. And, she's
No doubt.
happy about the impact she's had on the world, but it's painful for her. Yeah.
Yep. So, what can we do to change STEM so that it's more welcoming to everyone?
It starts at the beginning. I always think in terms of pipeline. So in terms of education, it is, how do you expose uh, young kids, of all ethnicities and genders around the world to STEM careers in a way that makes them attractive and accessible. Certainly in the workplace, in my workplace, and publishing is a very white, undiverse industry. We're constantly focusing on how do we attract people into publishing. But we've been working at the press on this issue of making STEM recognizable to kids at a young age through new children's publishing efforts that we're doing. We started a partnership with the wonderful Candlewick Press, which is one of the leading children's publishers in the country. And they happen to be located in Somerville, not far from us, with two new imprints, MIT Press Kids and MI Teens, that are focused, I would say, not just on STEM, I'd say STEAM field, so bringing in the arts as well. But at the MIT Press itself, we had started publishing graphic novels for adults, a few years ago, and have now started to do,
Oh,
um, graphic novels for young adults. One of them that I love that came out, I want to say it was last year or earlier this year, is called the Curie Society, and it's adventure stories illustrated in kind of comic book style of young women solving complex scientific problems, and has
named
been,
after Marie Curie?
named after Marie Curie. And next month, we actually have a book coming out called Power On, which is intended to make, tells, stories of coding for kids that show how empowering it is to be able to actually do computer programming and code. And it represents in the book through the
Wow.
illustrations just like a very diverse population of kids. And we're really, really excited about that one as well. So, because we in some of the normal adult publishing we were doing, whether it was, graphic novel treatments of complex topics. We had one on the history of feminism not too long ago, and then we had another one on the
Wow.
origins of the universe by the wonderful Clifford Johnson at USC. Um, we were realizing that there was a young adult audience for these books, and also for some of our essential knowledge books, which are very short introductions to topics, and started out in science and technology, and now it's across the range of fields that we publish in. We realized that this was just a natural direction for us to go in, but we also realized that we could do, some of these books for young adults, but when it came to publishing, truly publishing well for young children, that went beyond, our capabilities and our area of expertise. And from that came the decision to partner with Candlewick.
Wow, that's so cool. So I personally love graphic novels of complex topics. So some particular ones that have impacted me in recent years. There's a book called Logic Comics, which is
Yes.
about Bertrand Russell and
Mm.
logic.
Yeah.
And so it's called, yeah. So yeah, I learned a ton about philosophy and his really interesting biographical history, both as an academic as well as an anti-war activist. So that was really cool. It sounds like you're very familiar with it. And then
Yeah.
also, Yuval Noah Harari
Yeah.
is my favorite nonfiction author today. I absolutely love his book *Sapiens*, and now they're releasing it
Yeah.
as graphic novels as
I
well.
didn't,
The
I
first volume
actually
of that is
didn't
out.
know that. I love Sapiens too. I didn't know it was coming out as graphic novels. That's very cool.
Yeah, there's a
Neat.
first volume for sure that's out now at the time of recording, and
That's neat.
it's very well done, and I I could see how that can be appealing to young adults. The *Sapiens* one in particular, I think it seems to me like there's elements of it that they're trying to make it a bit more appealing to that younger audience. But Logic Comics is an adult book, and I just enjoy it. It's like a nice, we have to spend so much of our day feeling like we're being serious and reading,
Yeah.
rigorous things. And so it's really nice to be able to relax. And I'm quite a visual person. I created a book called Deep Learning Illustrated.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like visual approaches to conveying information. And yeah, so I love that those graphic novels exist. I can't wait to check out what MIT Press is releasing because I didn't know you were doing that until now.
Yeah.
And then going a step further, I love that you have this MIT Press kids that you're working with Candlewick on.
Candlewick. Yeah. We also have, we have in our MIT Press bookstore, which is, was closed for some time during the pandemic and just reopened within the MIT Museum here in Cambridge, a large children's section now, which is just fabulous. And it has not only our books, but books of other publishers that are intended to inspire young kids, all the way down to those like really little chunky books that you give to 9 months old, children into these topics. So
Wow. Cool. And so we got on to talking about this topic
yeah,
because we were talking about how we can help change STEM so that it's more welcoming to everyone. And so, for listeners that have forgotten that that's how we got here. Yeah, such an incredible example.
I guess it's sort of too easy to talk about, oh, we have these big problems in the world, but look at the world. We do. It's a world literally on fire, and we need all the brain power and compute power to be solving these big problems in the world.
For sure.
And part of, and so certainly when it comes to data science, that's the work of a lot of the listeners to this podcast. But in my world, I think about it, in terms of how do you shorten the path from idea and discovery to impact on the world? How do you broaden participation in research so that we can bring all that brain capacity around the world, starting at a young age, to bear on these issues? Fortunately, as a publisher who has to sustain and run a business, there's just been an explosion of growth in interest in these topics as well. So
Wonderful.
when I came back to the press almost 7 years ago, we had a very large and successful, and have for many years, publishing program for general readers in art and architecture and design, and much less so in STEM topics. And now, publishing books for, we like to call them books that honor the complexity of their subject matter, but they are books also for the general reader. Just very, very successful. And it feels like it's an opportunity for us as a publisher to actually have, an influence on public policy. I mean, that's the way I think about it.
So cool. Yeah. So now that I know that MIT Press is doing all this, it sounds like for me, finding gifts for people, which is perennially a big issue for me. Now, all of a sudden, no matter whether they're 9 months old or 90 years old,
Yeah.
I'm going to be able to find a great, super interesting book about a topic that I'm passionate about that could also help open horizons or perceptions of young people, old people, to the impact they could be making in the world with science and technology and engineering.
And you can be
Very
sure if
cool.
sure if it's a book coming from the press, it's going to be beautifully designed and often beautifully illustrated and packaged. But this isn't an advertisement, so.
No, it's true. Yeah, there's been no sponsorship by MIT Press or any this.
No.
Yeah, anything. This is entirely, yeah, my personal opinions and that are being reflected here. Cool, Amy. So we've talked about how things like the MIT Press Kids can be helpful for opening young people's eyes to opportunities in science and engineering, even if they come from historically underrepresented STEM backgrounds. Um, but going back to an earlier conversation in the conversation, we also talked about how open source can itself be a driver of more equality because we have more minds that can be involved. There's
Mhm.
fewer barriers to entry, and so with that in mind, and given your rich expertise in open source, what do you think is the best open source model going forward?
Um, Great question. It's something I think a lot about. What we're trying to do at the MIT Press is create open access models that don't perpetuate bias either in terms of access to the content, but also in terms of ability to participate as an author. Part of what's
Mhm.
happened over the course of the whole open access movement, and it's a movement that has a lot of very, very driven advocates behind it, is that we've reached a place right now in academic publishing where most of the open access that's happening is happening through pay to publish models. So when we talk about an open access journal, typically what's happening is the author is being asked, or they're getting money from their university or their grant funder to pay a publisher in exchange for making that work openly available. Okay, so the work ends up open access, but you've created a whole host of other inequities in terms of who's able to participate. Inequities across fields, because some fields have more grant funding across institutions, because some universities will have those resources, and certainly across geographic regions in the world. And
Certainly,
I
yeah.
love this particular example because it's a great example of what happens when we kind of reduce ourselves to simplistic binary thinking. Open is good and closed is bad, so open at all costs. And in fact, the issues here are very, very complex, and you need to think about models that don't essentially fall prey to this kind of unintended consequence. And that's what we've been trying to do at the MIT Press. So, for example, our open book model, which we launched this year, is a collective institutional subsidy model, which means that if we reach a threshold of institutional support, then we just open up all the books that we publish in a particular season, which we did for our scholarly monographs
Oh,
this year.
wow.
And you know we're not requesting that individual authors pay for that privilege. And so that's an example of the kind of model that I'd really like to see more of. And those of us who work on open access and open data, we're trying to come up with ways of funding and subsidizing the whole ecosystem to make open possible.
Really innovative. I hadn't heard of models like that before, and I had not thought of the issues inherent in the prevailing open source model today, where we rely on the author coming up with money, which of course, yeah, I hadn't thought of how that introduces its own biases. Huh. So, all right, going back to earlier in your career, you did a cognitive science PhD, and And at that time, it sounds like from conversation that you and I were having just before we started recording, that you also considered computer science as an option. So, what fascinates you about natural language and about natural language processing?
Um, yeah, so much to this day. We all think about the paths that we could have taken and didn't take. When I was an undergraduate at Barnard/Columbia, my undergraduate degree was in linguistics, and I had always been, fascinated. You were talking about, philosophy of language and logic, just fascinated by imposing formal structure on symbol and symbolic systems, and that could go in several directions. It could go into linguistics, it could go into the study of mind and language, certainly go into natural language processing. And I'd had a minor in computer science and thought about that path. So when I came to
No
MIT,
kidding.
yeah, when I came to MIT, I was in cognitive science, but largely studying linguistics, and had a secondary advisor in computer science, what's now CSAIL at MIT. Um,
Oh, yeah.
Someone whose focus was on natural language processing, um, and and I was interested as my career went on in um, how brains and machines learn symbolic systems and learn language, and ultimately kind of went in the human development direction. But because my focus, and this can only happen at MIT, right? Because my focus was on the formal structure of these systems, and I was working closely with Noam Chomsky. It was
Wow.
very much you know sort of formal modeling of these systems, and my dissertation was about this very, very esoteric thing in syntactic theory, and how this particular principle is learned by children in English, French, and Spanish. Um, yeah and I stayed in academia for a while, but realized that it was these larger kind of philosophical questions kept calling me back, and I found my way into publishing. I think I could have been pretty successful as an academic, and I still love to do research and publish, and I continue to do that kind of more in the field of scholarly communication and information science. But to me, it's so
Mhm.
closely related to what I was doing before.
Well, I, for one, am very grateful that you are doing what you're doing. I mean, yeah, no doubt you could have been, if you'd chosen to focus even more on academics than you have, you could have made an enormous impact. But I love the impact that you are making by, yeah, disseminating incredible literature, um, and now films as well. But on the note of your research, later research of yours is more about, as you kind of alluded to, authorship in academic research. So topics of credit, collaboration, contribution, attribution, even plagiarism. And you point to classifying contributions and setting standards for role taxonomy. Could you elaborate on why this is important, and what are the blockers, if any, to implementing a system like that?
Sure. Just I'll start just quickly on how this came about. So I mentioned that I had spent some time at Harvard in the provost office, and my job when I was there for about 4 or 5 years was to help pull together tenure and promotion cases, and look at people's kind of record of scholarship and excellence. Really, really fascinating work, also closely related to publishing. But it became clear to me that there's this issue. Like if you're preparing your CV or your dossier, um, and you happen to be a researcher where the main record of what you've done or achieved is a list of publications, um, there's a total mismatch between how that information is conveyed and what actually happened in the research. So,
Mm.
you may be familiar with the fact that it's pretty common practice in the sciences, which are increasingly multi-authored, to have the first author or the last author positions, which are the most prominent, be, say, the lab
Mhm.
head, the person who
Mhm.
obtained the funding. Um, And to have there be like no indication in a long list of authors, like who actually, was behind this methodology, who actually did this work, who actually did the
Right.
writing of this paper. And the fact that process, this sort of like two-dimensional way of representing authorship, obfuscates all the contribution underneath, just struck me as being one of the ways in which the biases that we've been talking about through this conversation get perpetuated, and particularly a
Right.
barrier for young researchers, because the culture of a lot of labs, I mean, of course it varies from field to field, is graduate students and postdocs might be doing the bulk of the work, but
Hmm.
might not be in that most prominent author position. So
Right.
the way I think about things as a sort of data scientist manqué, I guess, is that let's create another dimension on which to represent this other signal, right? That okay, we don't have to change anything about the order of author names, but we can have a way of signaling in a machine readable way that this individual contributed to the underlying statistical model, or this individual did the bulk of the data analysis or writing or what have you. And so while I was still working at Harvard, I pulled together a bunch of people I knew who would get this whole problem space, and a bunch of people who probably never thought about things that way, into a workshop. And this was 2012, I think, that we had this workshop. And just a couple of months ago, or maybe just a couple of weeks ago, the National Information Standards Organization announced that this taxonomy is now a formal technical standard,
Oh, wow.
which is really fun. And it's
Congrats.
again, it's collaborative work. There's several people involved. Worked most closely with my colleague in the UK, Liz Allen, and there were several people involved. But we over the years we've seen more and more publishers adopt this standard, so that it means that if you're publishing a paper in Cell, for example,
Hmm.
and you're contributing it, you're not only going to indicate who the authors are, you're going to choose from this standardized taxonomy of roles, who did what, and
Wow.
it's adoption is growing. There's still barriers, because it's obviously an imperfect taxonomy. There are only 14 roles, and there are many ways to talk about contribution. And of course, you know, the ways in which people contribute to research varies tremendously across the different
Right.
fields, but it's a good place to start. And so,
Yeah.
my hope is that it continues to grow, and it just changes the conversation, and enriches the vocabulary that we have to talk about how we've contributed to research or contributed to an article.
Very cool. I can see the utility in this. There are a handful of papers from my time when I used to be publishing papers regularly where it does state exactly what I did on the paper. And I'm always like, that seems really helpful. Like,
Yeah,
it just, it's nice that I'm being acknowledged for having done the statistical analysis, for example.
yeah,
And that it's clear that somebody else actually did all the writing and that I wasn't really involved in that at all.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it makes so much sense to be able to have that on paper. So, yeah, great that you've done that.
Yeah,
Um,
but the way it was being done in the past, though, was in a free text way,
oh,
right? And
totally.
so,
Yeah,
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 and
yeah.
so the whole point of standardizing it is again to make it machine readable. And
Right.
even though this kind of description is qualitative, essentially it provides a foundation for other quantitative metrics to be created that go beyond the kinds of metrics we use currently. Um,
100%. Yeah.
yeah, and I can imagine a whole other career for myself where all I did full time was work on different types of things like this, because I'm fascinated by it. And but I'm glad to see this come to fruition.
Yeah. Yeah. Super cool. I look forward to seeing more of that now that it has been approved as a standard.
Yeah,
Very cool. All right. So we've had an amazing interview, an amazing conversation so far. We're wrapping it up. We're getting near the end now. And so, near the end of these episodes, I always ask for a book recommendation. And I feel
sure.
like with some of my guests, that can throw them off guard. They weren't anticipating it. Some of them haven't been reading in a while, but now we've got somebody who has
Yeah.
book after book going under your nose every day. So.
It's
Yeah,
true. So I'll if you don't mind, I'll provide two. One is
please.
I absolutely love audio, and I
Mm.
especially love it when the writers I love read their own books. And so I found my way recently
Mm.
to Anne Patchett's most recent book of essays, which is called These Precious Days. And I just absolutely love it because this is a woman who's not only a phenomenal writer, but as I listen to her and I think like I just wish she were my best friend. She's like the sanest person in the world. But the other thing is she's just so passionate about books and the written word, and she runs her own bookstore in Nashville and tells a lot of
Oh.
stories about that. And so I've been recommending, this book to my colleagues at the press. But another book that I'm reading, not in audio, is one of her own books. That's called The Future of Work by MIT economist
Mm.
David O'Toole, and it tries to explain and then provide kind of remediation to the issue that in the kind of what we have considered like blue collar jobs in the U.S., less specialized jobs, that the U.S. has kind of been falling behind in providing the kind of computational skills and job growth that might be possible. And so it's about applying technology to the workplace in a way that promotes equity and financial growth
Wow.
for a broader range of people. And it's a fabulous book, and I'm proud that it's one that we've published.
Brilliant. Those both sound like great recommendations for our listeners. The first one, because they probably enjoy audio format, given
Yeah,
that they enjoy listening to this podcast. So being able to hear an author read her own work sounds great. And then the future of work. I mean, this is such a massive opportunity, and something that you were talking earlier about how publishing can influence policy. And this sounds like a perfect situation for that, because we have this huge problem of so many people, millions of people in the United States, who are being displaced by change. And some of that is related to AI and automation. Um, and it seems that the data that we're seeing more and more of, it seems like it, automation actually increases employment opportunities, and that the employment opportunities that people can have are more enjoyable. So the kind of work that gets displaced is laborious, repetitive work that humans don't really want to be doing anyway. And
yeah,
so there's a huge opportunity, but it only exists if people are being retrained.
right,
And if they're not retrained, then
exactly.
not only is that horrible on an individual level to be unable to find employment, but it's also, it's going back to the thing about having more brains involved. It's bad for our
Yeah,
society.
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So really great
good.
recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
So
This was so much fun. Thanks.
yeah, my pleasure, Amy. And so clearly, you are a brilliant person with lots of interesting perspectives on a broad range of topics. Is there any particular way that listeners should be connecting with you or following with you to hear your opinions going forward?
Well, I'm very easy to reach at MIT. I'm not very big on social media, but occasionally we'll tweet about things going on at the MIT Press. But I'm
There you
just
go.
open to folks reaching out to me over email. So
Nice. All right. And we'll be sure to include your Twitter handle
okay,
in the show notes. Thank you so much, Amy, for being on the program. And yeah, hopefully we'll have the opportunity to have you on again in the future.
I'd love that. Thanks so much.
What a special episode that was. Dr. Brand is such an inspiring, pioneering individual who's making the world a better place through her relentless creativity, intellect, and drive. In today's episode, Amy filled us in on what it's like to run the prestigious MIT Press that has brought us so many classic data science and machine learning books, including essential open access books like Goodfellow et al.'s Deep Learning. She talked about how open access makes scholarly work more impactful on society and makes it more equitable for historically underrepresented groups in STEM. She talked about how competition and open source solutions are needed to facilitate more open access publishing across more organizations. How her award-winning documentary Picture a Scientist grew organically out of interviews with exceptional female scientists. how publishing outstanding STEM books for broader audiences, including for children, can help address the biases that exist against women and minorities in STEM, and how author metadata in standardized taxonomies can help authors receive the credit they deserve for the work they've done for a given publication. As always, you can get all the show notes, including the transcript for this episode, the video recording, any materials mentioned on the show, the URLs for Amy's Twitter profile, as well as my own social media profiles at superdatascience.com/567. That's superdatascience.com/567. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd greatly appreciate it if you left a review on your favorite podcasting app or on the Super Data Science YouTube channel. I also encourage you to let me know your thoughts on this episode directly by adding me on LinkedIn or Twitter and then tagging me in a post about it. Your feedback is invaluable for helping us shape future episodes of the program. All right, thanks to my colleagues at Nebula for supporting me while I create content for you. And thanks, of course, to Ivana Siebert, Mario Pombo, Serge Massis, Sylvia Ogvang, and Kirill Eremenko on the Super Data Science team for managing, editing, researching, summarizing, and producing another inspiring episode for us today. Keep on rocking it out there, folks, and I'm looking forward to enjoying another round of the Super Data Science podcast with you very soon.